Hello students, and welcome to the final lecture for Political Science 1513 American Federal Government Online. Now I want to begin this video by saying that I'm glad you all made it through the semester. You should win a t-shirt saying I survived a class with Connor Alford, but instead hopefully you'll just get a good grade. Either way, I also have a brief formality that needs to be addressed before we dive into the learning objectives this week. Since we are talking about civil rights, we are going to have to talk about some very sensitive topics, issues, and history. In particular, we're going to spend a lot of time focusing our attention on African Americans and their struggle for equality under the law. What we will discover is that you can't really understand or contextualize or explain or teach civil rights law in our country without discussing race relations, and in particular without discussing how our country has historically treated African Americans. And this is true quite simply because many of the major Supreme Court decisions and statutory policies created by Congress, which shape current realities in civil rights and civil rights law for our country, are all going to originate with African Americans who will resist discrimination in the policies of their state or their country. And so what we will discover then is that the struggle for equality among civil rights activists for the African American community is inexorably tied and irreversibly interwoven with civil rights law in our country. So we are going to talk about these things. And I do want you to understand that the fact that we are going to spend so much time focusing on the struggles of African Americans means that there's not time left in our lecture for this week to dedicate very much attention to the struggles for civil equality by other groups of people. Other groups have also had equally valid struggles. Women, LGBTQ people, disabled individuals. All of these different groups have also had their own struggles that are equally important and for many of you equally relevant. But for our purposes today, we're not going to talk a lot about those. We don't have time to cover everything. So I'm going to focus on the bare essentials. And again, just because of historical realities, that means that we need to focus on African Americans. Not because their struggles are more important, but because their struggles are more historically connected to current realities in civil rights law for the United States of America. In other countries, perhaps civil rights law is more shaped by relationships between men and women, or by the society's treatments of disabled people. If we lived in one of those countries, I might focus on one of those groups, but we don't. We live in the United States, and this is an American federal government class, so we are going to focus on African Americans. But just to make myself 100% clear, do not take this as a normative judgment. The fact that I am focusing here tells you that the struggles of African Americans are more historically relevant to some of the cases we need to talk about, but it ought not be interpreted as indicating that they are more valid or more important than similar struggles by other groups. Okay, so having gotten that out of the way, let's go ahead and look at our learning objectives. And the first learning objective asks for you to explain the Equal Protection Doctrine, who it protects, when it protects them, and where it protects them. The second learning objective asks for you to summarize the key rulings of the United States Supreme Court with regards to the civil rights struggles of African Americans. The third learning objective asks for you to identify and explain each of the Civil War amendments. And then finally, the fourth learning objective asks for you to discuss the problems that continued to face African Americans after the Civil War and how these were eventually resolved or addressed by our government. So let's get started then by reviewing very briefly the general concept of a civil right. Remember that civil rights are active goods or services that we are entitled to receive from the government or government actors. And these active goods or services require affirmative action on the government's behalf. Unlike a civil liberty, the government cannot respect a civil right simply by choosing not to violate it. They actually actively must comply with it. So civil rights are sometimes called entitlements because, again, they are goods or services that we are entitled to receive. And they're sometimes called positive rights because they entail a positive duty, a duty of affirmative action which requires the government to provide certain particular goods or services that might be difficult for us to acquire on our own. Now, it might be possible for some people to acquire certain of these services on their own, but if you can't afford to acquire these services on your own, if you are unable or unwilling to do so, then the government has to intervene. And in our country, when I tell you that civil rights law allows us certain entitlements to particular goods and services, I'm really going to summarize all of this by citing what can be referred to as the Equal Protection Doctrine. And the Equal Protection Doctrine is a legal doctrine which maintains that as American citizens, we are entitled to be protected from unequal treatment based on certain protected characteristics such as race, gender, and disability in certain protected settings. So I'm going to reiterate that because this Equal Protection Doctrine, I want you to note, is the foundation for all civil rights law in our country today. And this Equal Protection Doctrine is a legal doctrine telling us that we as U.S. citizens have a constitutional right to be actively protected by the government from unequal treatment or discrimination based on certain protected characteristics including race, gender, or disability, and in certain settings, including the workplace, public facilities or accommodations, and education. Now I'm going to pause here because there are a couple of quick caveats and points that need to be made. First, understand that this list of race, gender, or disability are going to be the three primary protected characteristics that are fully recognized by the courts in our country. I also want to be clear, there are other groups that aren't listed here, and it's not an accident, because not every group of people is going to fall into a protected characteristic. A protected characteristic is going to be your race, your gender, or your disability. And if you belong to a group that is defined by its race, its gender, or its disability status, then you are what we refer to as a protected class. And when somebody discriminates against you on the basis of your membership within a protected class, then you have a civil rights case on your hands, and you can turn to the government to have this form of discrimination addressed. For instance, if you are fired because of your race, or if you discover that you're being paid less than your male counterparts because you are a woman, then you have faced unequal treatment on the basis of a protected characteristic. And therefore you can sue. You can go to the government, and it's the government's job to intervene on your behalf, to put an end to this discrimination, or else see that you are justly compensated for the discrimination that you have suffered. So again, this is the Equal Protection Doctrine. But understand that there are other characteristics that you can be discriminated on the basis of. For instance, an employer can fire you because you've got a large tattoo on your face. People with facial tattoos are not considered a protected class. An instructor can't fail you on the basis of your gender, your race, or your disability status. But an instructor most certainly could fail you on the basis of your work ethic. I can discriminate against lazy students who never show up to class and don't do their work by giving them a bad grade. But no professor could, or ever should, legally be allowed to discriminate by giving you a lower grade because of your gender, or your disability status, or your race. So understand again, some characteristics are protected and others aren't. Now this list might be expanding in the near future. There are some people who believe that we need to add to it to include LGBTQ status. So sexual orientation or gender identity ought to be included in the list of protected classes. And to some extent, they kind of are. But these are the three main protected classes that I want you to focus on, because the courts really haven't adequately resolved disputes about things like the amount of constitutional protection provided to individuals from discrimination on the basis of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And that is something that's important to remember, because that means that this Equal Protection Doctrine is still evolving, and it might change in the near future. It might be expanded to include other characteristics. So then the first two things to remember about this is, number one, it's still evolving, and number two, it's not absolute. We have no absolute right to be protected from unequal treatment. We only have a right to be actively protected by the government from unequal treatment on the basis of these particular characteristics. And even then, that government protection only applies in certain settings. So, for instance, what we are going to discover is that if somebody refuses to have sexual intercourse with you on the basis of your gender, they have discriminated against you. They might have been willing to have sex with you if your genitalia were different, but they have not violated your rights. And there is no civil rights case. You do not have any entitlement which would allow you to turn to the government to punish somebody who refused to have sex with you, even if they did so for a racist or an ableist or a sexist reason. So you're not entitled to protection from unequal treatment on the basis of race, disability, or gender, say in the bedroom, or in a private relationship, or in a private home. If you've got a friend who one day tells you that you're not allowed to enter their home on the basis of your skin color, well, first off, find a new friend, but second off, do understand that they're within their rights. You're not entitled to have access to somebody else's home, and they don't really have to justify why they are denying you that access. If they are denying access on the basis of your skin color, they're probably an ignorant jerk, but they are, again, within their rights. This is not true of an employer, of an educator, or a public employee who discriminates against you in one of these protected settings. So what are the protected settings covered by the Equal Protection Clause? Well, that's going to be the workplace, that's going to be education, and that's going to be public facilities or accommodations. So if we're talking about an employer who pays you less because of your gender, then there's a civil rights violation, and you can turn to the government for protection. If you are denied access to a college program on the basis of your skin color, there's probably a civil rights violation happening here, and you can turn to the government for protection. If your state passes a law which prohibits you from using a train, or if your state's public transportation doesn't have handicap accessibility, and this discrimination is targeting you or failing to provide you with appropriate accommodations because of your disability status, again, there's a civil rights violation. Now you can activate that government protection. So understand that this is evolving, that it's not absolute, and that it is contextual. It only applies to certain groups in certain settings. Now that we've established that, you basically have the summary of all civil rights law in the entire country, because this equal protection doctrine is the foundation for all civil rights in our nation, at least as they have been recognized by the courts. But I do also want you to understand a few things about this equal protection doctrine, these ideas about our affirmative, positive right to be actively protected from discrimination. And the first thing I want you to understand is that unlike civil liberties, civil rights don't really originate with the natural rights theory that John Locke articulated prior to the American Revolution. Remember that when John Locke was writing, when the American Revolution took place, when our Constitution was originally drafted, the concept of positive rights hadn't really entered into the human mindset, at least not in the Western world, perhaps in other parts of the world, but certainly not in America at this time. So remember that the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to our Constitution, really are going to primarily deal with civil liberties. Really what we're going to discover is that when our Constitution was written, the idea here was to protect people from oppression or discrimination or mistreatment by the government, by protecting certain freedoms from government intervention or intrusion or abridgment. But there were not really any positive rights understood to exist at the time that our Constitution was originally written. So how is it that we go from a Constitution that only protects civil liberties and not positive rights, a Constitution that protects negative rights but not civil rights, a Constitution that protects freedoms but not entitlements, to our current reality, where civil rights law is much, much more comprehensive than civil liberty law? Well, to answer that question, we need to talk a little bit about history, because what we're going to discover is that civil rights are going to be inferred rather than explicitly detailed in the United States Constitution. And they're going to be inferred by a court, which will continuously interpret and reinterpret the Constitution in light of changing realities. And in particular, their interpretation of the Constitution is going to evolve as it's amended, of course, but also as we continue to look at and learn about race relations and the treatment of African Americans in our country. So to start with, let's go back to the pre-Civil War era, and we're going to establish a baseline to see where African Americans started. And to establish this, let's look at the 1856 case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. In Dred Scott versus Sanford, we're really looking at a escaped slave, a guy by the name of Dred Scott, who was born into slavery in the state of Missouri, but later escaped to the Louisiana Territory, where he lived from 1833 to 1843 as a free man. And Dred was able to do this because in 1820, the United States federal government passed a law called the Missouri Compromise. And among other things, the Missouri Compromise banned slavery in the Illinois Territory. And what we will discover then is that he was able to live as a free man there, where slavery was banned. But after a decade of living as a free man, Dred decided to return home so that he could visit his family. And so he returns to Missouri, and he is basically found out by his former master and re-enslaved, at which point he files a lawsuit in Missouri court calling for his freedom and claiming that his residence in a free territory made him a free man. But he lost repeatedly, and he had to appeal all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. Meanwhile, Scott's former master maintained that no descendant of slaves, no African American person in our country, could be considered a citizen in the sense of Article 3 of the United States Constitution, and that because they were not citizens, because they were not persons, but they were property, they were not entitled to any constitutional protections. And if you're not entitled to any constitutional protections, then there is no rule which would preclude somebody in our society from enslaving you, even if you've spent the last decade living as a free man. And the courts are going to side with Dred Scott's former master. They're going to rule against Dred. He loses this case. They say that Dred was not a free man, even though he lived in a free territory, that he was a slave, that he was property and not a person. And they're going to justify this decision in a number of ways. But what I really want you to understand is that they're telling us that whether enslaved or free, no African American can ever claim protection under the Constitution. And the reason that they make this argument is that they again say that slaves are property, not persons. Citizenship is a status enjoyed by persons, not by property. And so if you don't qualify as a person, you cannot be a citizen. If you do not qualify as a citizen, then you do not qualify for constitutional protections. Therefore, they say, look, the court cannot declare that Dred is free. They cannot refuse to protect the property rights of his former master by allowing the former master to re-enslave Dred Scott. And that's a really big deal, because basically what that tells us is, first, that slavery is a constitutionally protected institution. The court rules in this case that it would be a violation of the Fifth Amendment to deprive a slave owner of their property. And they say, look, maybe you don't like people owning slaves, then don't buy a slave. But at the end of the day, it's their decision whether they want to own a slave, and the court doesn't have the jurisdiction to make that decision for them. The federal government, the states, government in general, is prohibited from violating the property rights of slave owners. It's a personal choice, not a government decision. So they say it's not the government's place to decide because slavery is protected in our Constitution, but the slaves themselves are not protected, and neither are their descendants. Now that's an important thing, because again, up until this point, it was thought by many people that if you were a slave, that was one thing. But if you were a free black man, then you ought to have the same basic freedoms and protections as any other free person. And the court says no. So this is important because it's really, again, going to be based pretty much entirely on race. And this is the government affirmatively, actively denying personhood and citizenship to African Americans and actively protecting their oppressors in our economy, the slave owners. So that's the reality that African Americans faced in our country prior to the Civil War. They were told that they didn't have any civil liberties at all. And if you don't have negative rights, then you most certainly don't have any positive rights. But we begin to see some change after the Civil War. Right, this is America's bloodiest conflict, and it makes a really big difference. After the American Civil War, we get a string of 3 amendments, which are collectively called the Civil War Amendments, because each of these three amendments was passed pretty much immediately after the American Civil War, and each of these three amendments is meant to address a problem that was either tackled by the Civil War or emerged in its aftermath. So the 13th Amendment is going to pass in 1865, and this basically abolishes slavery. We will no longer protect or accept slavery in our country after the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment tells us that citizenship has been redefined to encompass and include any newly emancipated slave or their descendants, and that it ought not be denied on the basis of former status as a slave or descendant from people who were once slaves. So taken together, these are going to overturn both of the major rulings of Dred Scott. But the 14th Amendment is also going to include the Equal Protection Clause. And this is a very important clause because it says that no state shall deny its residents the equal protection of the law on the basis of their skin color. Now, again, it doesn't use the exact language skin color, but that's how it's been interpreted by the courts. The exact language is that you're not supposed to discriminate on the basis of somebody's status as a former slave or descent from a person who was once a slave. But the courts have basically said that this means that you can't discriminate against people on the basis of their skin color. What's interesting about this, though, is that it targets the states. No state shall deny that equal protection. Whereas formerly, every amendment in the Constitution created prohibitions on federal action. Now we have extended certain prohibitions to the states. And they're also going to tell us that the states shall not deprive any individual of life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness, essentially, without due process of law. And this is what we're going to call the Due Process Clause. So again, what we're going to find is that the 14th Amendment redefines citizenship to include all persons who are born and naturalized in the United States, including those who used to be slaves. And it also tells us that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. This is important because those provisions are going to be used by the courts to incorporate virtually every part of the Bill of Rights against the states little by little in a process called gradual incorporation. Most recently, they incorporated the freedom to keep and bear arms. But for our purposes today, what we're going to discover is that the Equal Protection Clause is especially important. No state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Starting in the early 1900s, that is going to be interpreted by the courts to give us the equal protection doctrine. Now again, I want you to understand that this is an interpretation that requires some inference. Because if you read the Equal Protection Clause very carefully, literally speaking, it tells us that the states shall not discriminate. The states shall not deny equal protection. So many people would argue that as originally envisioned, the 14th Amendment was meant to create a new negative right, a freedom from government discrimination. But due to certain realities on the ground level, where states continuously find ways to work around that, or they get private actors to engage in discrimination on their behalf, the courts will reinterpret this particular portion of the 14th Amendment to create certain affirmative obligations on behalf of the government to protect individuals subject to discrimination on the basis of their skin color from this unequal treatment. And what we will discover is that they will further expand that and apply it to include other groups, including women and people with disabilities. So that's the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is arguably the most important of the Civil War amendments. It's definitely the most litigated of all amendments in the entire Constitution. No other case has shaped more Supreme Court rulings than the 14th Amendment. So what about the 15th Amendment? Well, the 15th Amendment prohibits racial discrimination in voting laws. Don't get confused. Many people come into college having been told in high school that the 15th Amendment gave black people the right to vote. That's not true. The Constitution never explicitly gives anybody the right to vote. But what the 15th Amendment is going to do is prohibit racial discrimination in voter eligibility requirements. So, in other words, states don't have to let you vote to decide who their governor will be. Oklahoma would be within its rights to say, hey, look, we're going to change our state constitution. And from now on, our governor is going to be selected by lottery. Or our governor will be selected by a vote of the state house and the state senate instead of a vote of the people. If that were the case, none of us would get to vote except those of us who were in the state legislature. And I'm presuming nobody listening to this video falls into that category. That would be okay under the 15th Amendment. But what the state could not do is create a rule that says white people get to vote and white people will decide who our governor is going to be, but black people will be excluded from that process. So no racial discrimination in voting laws. If you let one group of people vote, then you must let the other group of people vote. So that's where we're at. After the Civil War, we get the 13th Amendment, no more slavery. We get the 14th Amendment. Citizenship is now extended to African Americans. Dred Scott is effectively overturned. We've got equal protection, and we've got the Due Process Clause. And then we get the 15th Amendment, no more racial discrimination in voting laws. That's progress. But I do also want you to understand that problems persisted. Problems continued well after the Civil War. Because as I've already mentioned, states begin to find ways to get around these. In particular, states begin implementing a series of barriers, which, while on their face are not explicitly discriminatory, have the real-world impact or effect and intent of disenfranchising black voters. At the same time, they begin creating a series of racially discriminatory policies known as Jim Crow laws. And the Jim Crow laws were a series of racially discriminatory laws designed to sequester black people from mainstream society by mandating a separation of the races and implementing punishments for anyone who failed to comply with this, including private actors such as businesses. Let's go ahead and start by talking about some of the voting barriers. I want you to understand we're going to focus primarily on the legal barriers. There were other de facto barriers, like KKK intimidation, that also played a role. But for our purposes, we can't talk about it all, and we're therefore going to focus on active affirmative policies created by the states with the intent or effect of disenfranchising and demobilizing black voters even after the 15th Amendment. And the first of these policies is going to be a string of laws which require individuals seeking to vote to pass a literacy test under certain circumstances. A literacy test is an examination administered ostensibly for the purpose of determining whether a person meets the literacy requirements in order to vote. And on its face, there's nothing innately racist about literacy tests, because at least on its face, the idea of a literacy test is to ensure an informed electorate, to make sure that people are at least sufficiently educated to cast a meaningful vote and to know who they are voting for. But it's not an accident that these literacy tests don't really pop up in large numbers until after the 15th Amendment, when they become very common. And it's not an accident or a coincidence that they become very common in a lot of former Confederate states throughout the South. What we're going to discover is that while these are not explicitly racist, while they are not explicitly in violation of the 15th Amendment in a very strict sense, they are a way to circumvent that 15th Amendment and keep black people from voting. And we know this based on a great deal of evidence. We know this based on the private correspondences of the people who are responsible for these laws. But even if you don't look at those, there is some evidence that makes this conclusion seem pretty clear to any honest observer. So first, what we're going to discover is that the literacy tests were designed to be excessively difficult. Almost nobody who was asked to take these tests was actually able to pass. And if your goal is simply to make sure that people are sufficiently literate that they can read their ballot and cast an informed vote, it doesn't make sense to design a test that many college professors today would probably fail, especially at this time where we don't really have widespread or especially sophisticated public education, and especially at this time when a very large portion of the population is illiterate, especially the poor population, and especially the African American population. So first, the fact that these tests were overwhelmingly difficult indicates that there's a more nefarious purpose behind them. What we're also going to discover is that they were not administered in an equal manner. Instead of simply requiring every voter take a literacy test, which would essentially preclude any kind of meaningful democracy, the states decided that they were going to let the white polling personnel decide who would have to take these tests. Now, on the surface, again, this is not necessarily discriminatory, because they didn't necessarily explicitly say, give the test to black people, but let white people vote without ever having to take it. But that is the effect that actually happened, because these individuals were instructed to single out people that they thought looked illiterate. And of course, being a bunch of white Southern men in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, they decided that the voters who looked illiterate were those with dark skin, African Americans. So by and large, if you were a white person and you showed up to vote, you probably didn't have to take a literacy test. That's not universally true. Some white people were also affected by this, but disproportionately, the victims of literacy tests were African Americans. And if you failed to pass the literacy test, you were sent home without being able to cast your ballot. But if this is not enough evidence, there's one final characteristic of the literacy test laws which makes their racially discriminatory intent and impact even more evident. The literacy tests contained what we would now call a grandfather clause. And this term, grandfather clause, really originates with these Jim Crow laws. But the grandfather clauses of the Jim Crow laws, these literacy tests in particular, basically created exemptions for anyone who could prove that their grandfather or other ancestor voted prior to the Civil War. What this meant is that if you were a white person and you did get randomly selected to take a literacy test, you had a get-out-of-jail-free card in many cases. You could point to an ancestor who was able to vote, and then you wouldn't have to take the literacy test. Now again, if our purpose here is to ensure that you're sufficiently literate, it doesn't make sense to include this exemption, but it is included, because there's one group of people that definitely could never prove that they had a grandfather who voted prior to the Civil War. African Americans. Because prior to the Civil War, they were in bondage. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't even given basic liberty. They were under the Dred Scott president. So the inclusion of these grandfather clauses is more or less the nail in the coffin, which makes it really obvious that literacy tests were designed intentionally to keep black people from participating fully and equally in our democratic society. But it wasn't just the literacy tests. We also had poll taxes. A poll tax is a uniform fee levied on every adult without reference to income or resources as a condition for voting. Now, I do want to note that poll taxes, like literacy tests, are not on their face innately racist. And I also want to note that poll taxes, unlike literacy tests, were actually not all that uncommon prior to the American Civil War. Because here's the thing, facilitating an election takes resources. You need people to design, print, proliferate, and count ballots. And you need people to provide instructions, and they probably want to be paid. And you need facilities to process all of this. There's a lot that goes into running an election. And that means that states have to fork out some money. So the poll taxes were originally designed to be very modest fees that were there for the purpose of covering the expenses encompassed by the state in administering elections. So there's nothing innately wrong with that in a racial sense, although it might be problematic for other reasons. Where poll taxes become racially problematic is when they increase in their abundance and the severity of the fees that they expect you to pay after the 15th Amendment, especially in these southern states. Not a coincidence. This happens because what we're going to discover is that after the Civil War, African Americans are made up in large part of either emancipated slaves or people who descended from emancipated slaves, and they were an extremely poor demographic. So, again, if you were a poor white, the poll tax might have precluded you from voting as well, because poor whites, quite frequently, were unable to pay these taxes. But disproportionately, it was black people who were impeded in their ability to cast ballots by the poll taxes. And that was probably the intention behind a good number of these poll taxes. So these are the two major voting obstacles that are going to shut African Americans out of the democratic process after the Civil War. But what about the rest of mainstream society? Well, that's where these other Jim Crow laws come in. Because remember, Jim Crow laws were not limited to voting barriers. Jim Crow laws were a series of discriminatory policies that were designed by mainly southern states for the purpose of closing African Americans out from participation in society as a whole. So that meant that they were denying opportunities in the realms of employment, education, social gatherings, and community engagement. And there were a number of other Jim Crow laws that we can talk about. We're going to start with the anti-miscegenation laws. An anti-miscegenation law is a law prohibiting interracial marriage, and these were created throughout the South. Now again, the states were able to claim that this was not a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, because it applied equally to both whites and blacks. A white woman was no more allowed to marry a black man than a black man was allowed to marry a white woman. But once more, what we're going to discover is that in practice, the real-world impact of these anti-miscegenation laws disproportionately harmed African Americans by shutting them out from an entire avenue of socioeconomic advancement. Because as we all know, there are many ways to get wealthy in our country, and one of them is to marry into money. But remember, at this time, African American families, by and large, weren't particularly wealthy. And there were a good number of wealthy white families. So marrying into money probably required that you marry a white person, which you would not be allowed to do now if you were an African American. And again, that's the intent and purpose behind these policies. Because by prohibiting interracial marriage, they were keeping African Americans from getting money or gaining resources. Because here's the thing, groups of people are very powerful when they begin accumulating money, which they can use to organize and communicate with one another. And as you can tell from these other policies, and probably from your basic knowledge of U.S. history after the Civil War, that's not something that the white-dominated governments of the southern states wanted to see. So we get anti-miscegenation laws that prohibit interracial marriage. And I'm going to go ahead and note right here, because I don't think it's included on subsequent slides, but I do want you to jot this in your notes. This is going to be overturned in the 1900s by a Supreme Court case called Loving versus Virginia. So one obstacle that continued to plague African Americans in their struggle for equality after the Civil War were the anti-miscegenation laws. And these were remedied by the Supreme Court in Loving versus Virginia. The next type of Jim Crow law that we're going to talk about are those that mandated racial separation in public places and private businesses. Now, to be clear, many private businesses were happy to go along with this, but many others were actually rather resistant to it. In fact, that's going to become pertinent when we get to the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. But before we jump ahead, I want you to understand that these laws basically said that African Americans and white people were not supposed to be mingling together in certain areas. In particular, restaurants, movie theaters, parks, these types of facilities were required to keep black and white employees separated, black and white clientele separated. So if you were a restaurant owner and you had a small ma and pa shop that you ran and you wanted to serve individuals in your community, and some of those individuals are white while others are black, you would have one of two options. One option is to say, I'm only going to serve African Americans, or I'm only going to serve whites. The other option was to double the size of your operation, creating two entirely separate seating operations or areas, one for the blacks and one for the whites. And most businesses simply couldn't afford to do that. If any of you have any experience in small family businesses, you understand that maintaining two separate facilities, doubling the size of your restaurant, would involve a massive financial burden. And what we will discover is that because of this, many of these restaurants just said, look, we're not going to seat black people. This was especially true in areas where there was not a substantially large African American population. Where there were very large African American populations, sometimes you saw the opposite. So for example, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was an area known as Black Wall Street, which is integrally tied to a historical event known as the Tulsa Race Riot that I'd like you to look at and that I think is also discussed by your textbook. In Black Wall Street, all of the restaurants served only African Americans. They did not serve white people. But the areas in our nation where African Americans constitute a majority are fairly fairly low in number, whereas there are an innumerable number of areas in which they are not the majority. And so in most places, this basically just meant that African Americans were completely closed out from going to see movies or going to restaurants or enjoying other services that other people got to benefit from. And again, by separating up the races, they're helping to prevent African Americans from forming connections with moneyed interests. Because remember, white people at this point control most of the money. And if you're brushing shoulders with, eating lunch with, being friends with, intermingling with white people, and some of those people have money, then you're making friends with people that might put you in a position to someday make money as well. Or that might give you a good job because you're their friend. And then you have money, then you have power, then you're harder to disenfranchise. And the white governments don't want that. So, once more, what we're finding is that these disproportionately have a negative impact on African Americans. But it's not just parks and private businesses. We're also going to find Jim Crow laws that target education and that begin to mandate racial separation in public schools as those emerge and become a thing in our country. And once more, this is a way to keep black people down. Now, I do want to be clear. The idea that the African American schools were equal to those of white schools is largely unfounded, but not universally untrue. There were some cases in which the black school was approximately as well funded and established as the white school. It did happen. It was an exception, I think, rather than the norm. There were plenty of cases in which the white kids got a really nice school and the black kids got a really bad school. But let's ignore those just for a moment. And let's look only at the cases in which whites and blacks went to separate schools that were roughly equally well funded. The fact of the matter is you're still sending black kids off through their own school, which again means that they're not able to do things like make friends with white kids whose families might have money and who might one day, having formed a close friendship, become a business partner or help you to advance up the socioeconomic ladder. So you're cutting them off from forming connections from a very early age. But not only that, you are, it will be argued in Brown versus Board of Education, causing psychological harm. Because by telling people that they're not allowed to intermingle with a majority of the human population in their country, you send this message to them that they are inferior or that they are in some way to be denigrated and treated separately. And that's harmful. It's hurtful. And it was perhaps meant to be hurtful. So, what we'll discover is that after the Civil War, problems persist in the form of voting barriers and Jim Crow laws. And the first really big Supreme Court challenge to these discriminatory Jim Crow laws is going to emerge in the 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson. In this case, we're going to deal with a gentleman by the name of Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 African American. And this became an issue for Mr. Plessy because Louisiana, the state in which he resided, created a new law called the Separate Act, which required separate railway cars for black and white passengers. This, again, is going to be a part of those Jim Crow laws. And what we're going to find is that a group of individuals known as the Committee of Citizens approached Homer Plessy, and they approached one of the railway companies operating in Louisiana. And they proposed creating a situation that would give them a case in controversy so that they could challenge this law and try to get it overturned on the grounds that it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And the railroad company was eager to get involved. Because remember what I told you. These laws created financial burdens for a large number of private interests, including these railway companies. The railway companies are looking to make some money, which they're going to do by selling tickets, to individuals from the general public. And a large number of those potential clients are African Americans. So they don't want to discourage African Americans from riding the train. And they don't want to have to shell out the cash necessary to double the size of their passenger carts by building a completely separate car for African Americans. So Homer Plessy and the railway company team up with the Committee of Citizens, and they arrange for Homer Plessy to get arrested for riding in a whites-only car. Because as somebody who was 1/8 African American, Homer Plessy technically qualified as a black man under the Separate Car Act of Louisiana. So that's exactly what happens. He gets arrested, and they file a lawsuit, and they take this all the way to the United States Supreme Court, which rules 7-1 that racial segregation is completely consistent with the Constitution. Now, of course, we know that that is nonsense. Right? This is eventually going to be overturned in that Brown versus Board of Education case that you can see at the bottom of the slide. But at the time of Plessy versus Ferguson, the court held that the state law was constitutional. And in an opinion authored by Justice Henry Billing Brown, the court tells us that state-mandated racial segregation did not violate the 14th Amendment. And they're going to make this case by arguing that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment was intended to establish absolute equality for the races before the law, but not in reality. The law cannot discriminate, but that doesn't mean that everyone should live under equal conditions necessarily. Furthermore, they're also going to tell us that while the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause was supposed to create equality before the law, it did not necessarily preclude separate treatment. Unequal treatment is precluded, but they say separate treatment is not precluded by the 14th Amendment. And they say that separation does not imply inferiority, either before the law or in any other way. So they're going to invent a legal myth known as the separate but equal doctrine. And the separate but equal doctrine upholds laws mandating racial segregation on the grounds that they create separate but not necessarily unequal treatment and facilities. They basically said, look, Homer, you're going to get where you're going whether you ride in this car or that car, so there's absolutely no reason that you can claim that this is unequal treatment. Now, once again, we know that this is a legal myth because quite frequently the facilities were not equal, and that was probably the case in Louisiana. But like it or not, the court decides to ignore all of these realities. They ignore the negative psychological impact of these policies. They ignore the fact that many of these facilities are fundamentally discriminatory in their quality. And that remains the reality. The Supreme Court validates racial segregation. It protects constitutionally racial segregation in our country. And it won't even begin to reassess this decision, to pull back on that precedent, which, by the way, is still technically on the books, until 1954, when we get the case of Brown versus Board of Education. Now, Brown versus Board of Education was actually technically two distinct cases, and each of these cases actually involved a consolidation of several other cases that had already gone before lower courts. But we're going to simplify this, and basically here's what I want you to understand. This was a law that mandated racial segregation in public schools, and it was challenged before the Supreme Court, again, on the grounds that the racial segregation of public schools, segregation based solely on race, was inconsistent with and in violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Remember what Plessy versus Ferguson told us. They said that the separate treatment of individuals in our society did not necessarily constitute unequal treatment. But now in Brown versus Board of Education, we get the opposite argument. We say that in at least certain circumstances, separate treatment is in fact fundamentally unequal. They, in Plessy versus Ferguson, said that separating whites and blacks to different train cars, or perhaps even classrooms, is no different than separating men and women into distinct bathrooms. Still pretty equal, but they are separate. Now again, we know that's not true. And so in Brown versus Board of Education, we have got to question that. But here's an interesting thing. The particular plaintiff, Mr. Brown, in this case, was suing on behalf of his daughter, who he wanted to send to a white school. But as it turns out, the school in his city that was reserved for African Americans was not of a substantially lower material quality than the white school. And they had very well qualified teachers. They were very well funded. It was a nice facility. No less nice or more nice than the white facility. And yet, what we're going to discover is that it's still fundamentally unequal. Why? In this case, the Supreme Court overturns racial segregation in public education. And they're going to do this by saying even if the facilities are equal, the very separation of white and black students has a detrimental effect on the educational and personal growth of African American children and on their psychological well-being, because it instills in these children from a very early age a sense of inferiority. And that sense of inferiority, that hurt self-esteem, has sweeping consequences that hang with an individual throughout his or her entire life. And incidentally, that happens to be supported by the social data. And in this particular case, they looked at some empirical studies. And you can do some research on those. I'm including some content in the optional content for this week's coursework folder that I'd encourage you to take a look at, where you can discover some of the particular empirical studies that they examined. But what they found is that, again, even if on their face the material quality of these separate educational facilities were approximately equal, the simple fact that you are separating one segment of the population from the majority of people in their nation makes them feel inferior. And especially when we're looking at small school children, this is an active, damaging, bad thing that you are doing to people. So what we will find is that while Brown does not explicitly overturn Plessy in its entirety, it does, at least for public education, reject the doctrine of separate but equal, which today has all but disappeared, at least in the context of race. So Brown versus Board of Education overturns the most pertinent parts of Plessy versus Ferguson by banning de jure segregation of public schools. Now, I want you to remember that de jure means by law. So in this case, we are overturning government mandates requiring racial segregation. But we're not going to address de facto segregation until later. De facto segregation is segregation by fact. So if, for example, you have a city where 99% of African Americans live in neighborhood A and 99% of Caucasians live in neighborhood B, and each of these neighborhoods has its own school, then it might turn out that all of the children in neighborhood A's school system go to school with all black students, and all of the children in neighborhood B go to school with all white students. If you live in Higgins, Texas, this is a town in the panhandle of Texas with a population of about 300, and that population is pretty much 100% white. You will probably go to school with all white students, and will probably not be an African American in your class. But that's de facto segregation. That's not segregation mandated by law. And if an African American family were to move to Higgins, Texas, they would admit the children in that family to their school, because there's no law prohibiting race mingling. So de jure segregation is overturned, but de facto segregation is overlooked by Brown versus Board of Education. I also want you to understand that Brown versus Board of Education is very limited. It only applies to public education. So we will discover that this is a monumental step forward, and historically it is very important because it launches the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Emboldened by this decision, Rosa Parks will refuse to give up her seat to a white passenger on a bus. She will be arrested for this, and her arrest will spark a series of bus boycotts, which are going to be very successful. And these are going to be organized by a gentleman you might have heard of called Martin Luther King Jr., who leads an organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And the success of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in organizing these boycotts is going to launch the Reverend Doctor to national attention. And he's going to use this newfound visibility to organize a certain March on Washington where he gives a certain speech. So historically, we cannot overstate the significant progress made with Brown versus Board of Education. But we also need to understand that it was still legally limited, and it was not an absolute rejection of all of these Jim Crow policies. So we still have problems persisting. And this is true even in public education. Okay, so first off, remember, Brown does not overturn the laws mandating segregation of train stations or restaurants or parks, and it does not overturn these other policies which are also detrimental to African Americans, including literacy tests and poll taxes. And it only applies to public education, which means that private schools can still discriminate. But even within public education, schools use the fact that de facto segregation is not being addressed by the courts as an excuse to get around the decisions that the court makes by doing things like gerrymandering their school districts. They create whole new school districts which they place in African American communities so that they can say, well, we're sending all of the African American students to that school down the street because of where they live. It's not because of their skin color. It just so happens that African Americans live in that area. Now, again, we know that they do this on purpose to continue separating the races. They're trying to get around federal law. But that's very hard to prove in a court of law. And on paper, on its face, technically, they are discriminating not on the basis of skin color, but on the basis of where you live. You are being told you cannot go to this school, which might be nicer, or which might be better for you, or might be more consistent with your expectations, not because of your skin color, but because of where you live. They are limiting your freedom to decide which school you will go to, not because you're a black person, but because you live in a black neighborhood. So de facto segregation is abused to get around Brown versus Board of Education, and those Jim Crow laws are still in effect. And therefore, the problem isn't solved yet. And our next big step forward isn't going to come for another decade. But when it does emerge, it does so in the form of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the first major piece of civil rights legislation in our country at the federal level. And it addressed de facto segregation of public schools. It swept away most of the Jim Crow laws by prohibiting racial discrimination in businesses, either against clientele or against employees. So we're no longer separating the seating arrangements or areas for African Americans and Caucasians. And that means that, again, this act effectively sweeps away most Jim Crow laws. But once again, what we will discover is that it is in and of itself not all that effective. It's important, it's progress, but it doesn't ultimately solve the problem. And the reason that it's not going to effectively solve this problem is that those voting barriers we described earlier are still in effect. We still have literacy tests, and we still have poll taxes. And what this means is that African Americans aren't able to vote. And if African Americans aren't able to vote, they can't elect state and local leaders who will look out for their wants, needs, and interests. And if they can't elect state and local leaders to look out for them and to enforce this federal law, then on the ground level, they're not actually going to get to enjoy its benefits. Because here's the bottom line. At the end of the day, the federal government can say whatever it wants. The people who actually have the most intimate, direct, and immediate impact on your day-to-day life are your state and government agencies, your state and government officials. Police officers are employed by state and local government, not by the federal government. And so if they aren't going into businesses that are refusing service to African Americans and arresting those business owners, it will continue. And remember what I told you. While many businesses did resist the racial segregation policies in our country, others were perfectly happy to go along with it, especially in certain parts of the South. And so, what we will discover is that on paper, no more racial discrimination in business after the Civil Rights Act. In practice, we still have that racial discrimination. So the next step then is to address those voting barriers. And that's exactly what we're going to do. In 1964, we get the 24th Amendment. And the 24th Amendment bans the use of poll taxes. And 1 year later, we get the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, don't confuse the Voting Rights Act of 1965 with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Civil Rights Act dealt primarily with those Jim Crow laws. The Voting Rights Act deals primarily with racially discriminatory voting policies. Now, it's going to do a number of things. First, it says no more literacy tests. But in addition to that, it takes some other steps. So first off, there are a whole bunch of other racially discriminatory voting policies that popped up in different places around our country that are also going to be overturned, but that we don't have time to talk about. But second off, I want you to understand that a really controversial portion of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 basically took away the power of 6 states to create their own election policies. These 6 states were Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Virginia. In 1975, this was amended to add Alaska, Arizona, and Texas, giving us a grand total of 9 separate states that were no longer allowed to make their own election policies. In addition to this, many individual counties, especially in places like California, also lost their sovereignty over election policies. Now, the reason that this is controversial is that if you recall from prior lecture, the Constitution of the United States includes the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment says any power not explicitly given to the federal government by the Constitution or prohibited to the states by the Constitution belongs to the states. And there is absolutely nothing in the Constitution authorizing the federal government to regulate election policies. So under the 10th Amendment, what we're going to find is that it had been understood that election policies belong not to the federal government but to the states. And after the Voting Rights Act, that remains true for 41 states. But for those 9 states, from Alabama to Texas, from Georgia to Arizona, and from South Carolina to Alaska, the policies that the state wants to implement are going to be subverted to federal authority. Now, they can still make laws occasionally, but they have to ask for permission from the federal government. And again, many people see this as unconstitutional, and they have a pretty strong legal case to make. In fact, we're going to discover that they will eventually get this portion of the Voting Rights Act overturned in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013. So these events aren't so far removed. These events are continuing to affect our country today. But I want you to understand that the decision to strip these 9 states of their sovereignty over their own election policies was not made lightly. There was a reason for it. Quite simply, the 9 states who lost their right to create their own election laws were states which had, for a very long time, exhibited a persistent history of racial discrimination in voting laws. And there had been other attempts at both the state and federal level to get rid of these racially discriminatory voting laws, and the states kept finding loopholes. These 9 states, every time they had one of their racially discriminatory policies overturned by a court or limited by a federal agent or limited by some piece of legislation, would just go back and rewrite the bill, making it slightly different, change the law very minutely so that the effect was still the same, but they could claim that they were in compliance with the federal or judicial order. So they kept finding ways to get around these policies, trying to ensure equal access to the ballot. And remember, 14th Amendment tells us when states are racially discriminating against their citizens, it is the federal government's job to step in. So this is the federal government stepping in And it's going to do so in a very big way. This is the nuclear option. They say, look, we have tried to dissuade you from abusing your power over election laws for racially discriminatory purposes and ends, and it's not working. So now you don't get to make your own rules. You need our permission to regulate your elections and create policies about who gets to vote and how they're going to do so. That remains in effect until 2013, and then again we get Shelby County versus Holder. Now, many people will tell you Shelby County versus Holder overturned the Voting Rights Act, and that is not true. Most of the Voting Rights Act remains intact today, but it does overturn that one provision stripping these 9 states of their right to make their own election laws without federal permission. And the court is going to do so by arguing that while this measure was necessary in 1965, realities have changed. In 2013, the KKK is not a real force in American politics. It's a tiny, infinitesimal fringe group, universally loathed by the vast majority of the population in every state, including the states on this list. And by and large, if you speak to a South Carolinian, if you speak to a Texan, if you speak to an Alaskan, if you speak to somebody from Virginia or Georgia, they will agree that racially discriminatory voting policies are bad. So the court says, look, at this time, the states needed to have some federal oversight. But we don't have a huge problem with these states actively going after black voters anymore. So let's let them exercise the same election rights that the other 41 states get to exercise. And therefore, these 9 states now today get to make their own laws, and so do those California counties. But the debate persists. Because one of the first things that happens in places like South Carolina after the Voting Rights Act has this portion overturned by Shelby County versus Holder is the implementation of photo ID requirements for voting. Now, we've talked about these in the past, and I want you to understand that this history helps to explain why people feel that these might be racially discriminatory. I've told you, the empirical studies are clear. Photo ID laws do not demobilize black voters. That seems pretty evident from studies that have looked at the consequences of these policies. But many people are still opposed to the policies because they feel that they were implemented with the intent of keeping African Americans from voting. And the reason that they have this suspicion is that, again, these states have a history of doing those types of things. Now, again, the Supreme Court says that that's history, and it's not a present reality. But if you disagree, if you think that Texas and South Carolina and Georgia, that Mississippi and Virginia, that Alaska and Arizona are still very racist, it might make sense to be a little suspicious of their new policies. So again, what I want you to understand is that this struggle is not necessarily complete. We do not necessarily have absolute equality of the races, but we have made a great deal of progress. And what we will find is that this history is very pertinent to developments which continue to shape our world today. Shelby County v. Holder was 2013. That's not that long ago. And we see some ramifications of de facto segregation in our public schools, even now, after we had the Civil Rights Act, which overturned those Jim Crow laws and attempted to enforce the racial desegregation of our schools by mandating racial integration, by requiring African Americans to be bused to all white schools and Caucasian students to be bused to formerly all black schools. And if you don't believe me that these policies are still shaping government and politics today, I have saved this little tidbit about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 being used to enforce desegregation for a very particular reason. Because this cropped up in the 2020 presidential election cycle when a Democrat candidate for president competing in the Democratic political primary was attacked by some of the other candidates, was called out for having voted against this policy, for having voted against the enforced desegregation of public schools, by having voted against the mandated racial integration, the busing of white and black students. And that individual, of course, is former Vice President Joe Biden. Now, Joe Biden does not oppose this policy today, at least not in his own words. But the fact that he had a history of having opposed it at some point in the past, again, was used against him very effectively and on live television during the Democratic primary debates. And this is something that he's had to deal with. This is something that really affects a candidate's electoral viability. So one last time, I want you to understand, we've made a lot of progress. We're not necessarily done, but we are still feeling the ramifications of history. All right, y'all. I hope you've enjoyed this semester and this lecture. I'll talk to you later. Bye.